Welcome back, everybody. This is a new episode of Ottolina English, and it's a very special episode, I'd say, because as you can see, we have the great pleasure to have with us Professor Gabriel Rockhill. Professor Rockhill is the founding director of the Critical Theory Workshop, Atelier de Théorie Critique, professor of philosophy and global interdisciplinary studies at Villanova University, one of the editors-in-chief of the World Marxist Review, and co-editor of the book series on the anti-imperialist Marxism. So thank you very much, Professor, for accepting our invitation and for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me on, and thank you for everything that you do.
So, Professor, I'd like to start with some main topics that has to do with how the left should analyze the rise of a multipolar world, as well as China, Russia, and BRICS countries in general. And one of the point is that because many people today, at least that's our impression, many people on the Western left, particularly, struggle to accept that class struggle today, as in many other times in history, actually, is linked to the fight for sovereignty and national independence. I'm thinking, for instance, of countries like Italy, where I actually live, and Germany, which are gradually becoming poorer due their financial and military ties to the American empire, or also of many Latin American countries that must constantly defend themselves economically and politically from attacks and exploitation by the US economy oligarchies. So what do you think about that?
Well, I think in order to understand the emergent multipolar world, you really have to frame it within the deeper history of imperialism. And I mean by imperialism, the kind of broadest understanding of the ways in which the history of capitalism has been premised upon the subjugation of the majority of the planet in its subjection to underdevelopment in order to develop the imperial core and ultimately line the pockets of the ruling class. And they've done this through the thievery of natural resources, the use of cheap or even free labor pools in the case of slavery, and then the use of markets. And this process of imperialist underdevelopment of the global South for the development of the global North has really structured the last few centuries. I mean, it's life under capitalism on planet Earth. But that process has gone through a number of very significant changes that I'll just highlight very briefly in order to situate the multipolar world in relationship to it. One is that the dominant imperialist powers in Western Europe, after having colonized the entire planet, entered into conflict with one another, and a phase of inter-imperialist rivalry, or what Lenin referred to more specifically as imperialism as the high stage or the last stage of capitalism. And due to that inter-imperialist rivalry and the fights between the imperial powers, there was a kind of contradiction that made it such that there was space for socialism to emerge. And that's, of course, what happened in 1917 with the founding of the Soviet Union. These inter-imperialist rivalries continued, though, through the course of the kind of 30 years that led up to the Second World War. And an additional element was added to that, and that is that the capitalist ruling class was really intent on killing socialism because of the ways in which it impinged upon the super profits of the colonial and imperialist system. And so World War II was largely a war waged, the core of it was the fascist powers who were late to the colonial feast, right? Germany, Italy, and Japan wanted in on the super profits that were characteristic of the history of capitalist colonialism. And Nazi Germany in particular waged a war of annihilation against the Soviet Union in order to finish the work that the 14 capitalist countries who had invaded the Soviet Union failed to do in the wake of its founding. And once again, though, they failed and this backfired. So World War I helped produce the Russian Revolution. World War II led to a global anti-colonial revolution in which both national projects of self-development and socialist projects emerged around the world. So between about the 1940s and the 1980s, you actually had a phase when imperialism was on its heels. And it was on its heels largely due to the success of socialism in driving, revolutionary socialism, driving the anti-colonial revolutions. This led, though, to another phase, which is really the attempt on the part of the imperialist powers to turn back the clock and go back to the great phase of the earlier phases of imperialist super profits. And through a whole series of complex mechanisms, the neoliberalization of the capitalist economy, its financialization, the offshoring of the productive economy, and so forth, eventually rolled back socialism within the Warsaw Pact countries, and it was an enormous setback for the global socialist movement. There was a long age of triumphalism, but this sets the stage for what we're seeing today, and that is that countries like China remained socialist. They engaged in a process of reform and opening up in order to chart out a very different relationship to the Western imperialist powers than we'd seen prior to that point in time. And the overall objective, I think, was to use the strength of their adversaries against themselves to some extent by allowing China to be used to a limited extent for its labor pools. And at the same time, it was getting technology transfer from the West, developing its own productive forces, and engaging in a process of internal development that allowed, I mean, this was also fighting the kind of, or using the anarchic elements of capitalism, because of course the capitalists wanted cheap labor pools. And so they played into, to some extent, some of the strategies that the Chinese had laid out. And over time, the Chinese have developed an alternative model of development that's not imperialist development. And in the current context, then, you have China as one of the driving forces behind a multipolar world. I should note, of course, that their model of development is not based on military conquest, covert operations, destabilization campaigns, election meddling, debt entrapment, sanctions, information warfare, and everything else that the imperialist powers have done. It's based on the principle that nations should have a right to self-determination and to development that is prosperous and fosters common prosperity for all nations involved. So in this regard, coming finally to the core of your question, the multipolar world, which of course not only includes China, but a number of countries that are not socialist, like Russia, like Iran, many countries around the world. But what the multipolar world is attempting to do at a minimum is to reject the imperial world order, meaning the underdevelopment of the overwhelming majority of the planet for the super profits of the imperial ruling class. And in that regard, as a tactic for loosening and ideally breaking the chains of imperialism, I think it's absolutely integral to the progressive left to support the multipolar world as a new way of fighting against imperialism. It's not the Third International, it's not other earlier iterations of it, but this is the other element that I wanted to highlight, and that is that the multipolar world isn't an end in itself. And it's helpful to distinguish between tactics and strategies. Tactics are the kind of short-term procedures that are undertaken in order to advance little by little to the strategy, which is the overall goal. And I think the overall goal should be dismantling imperialism in all of its forms and the capitalist world system in order to move humanity as a whole in the direction of socialism. So that should be the overall strategy. That should be the objective. But given the extant play of forces and the rolling back of socialism during the neoliberal phase, it would be ultra-leftist and kind of disconnected from reality to assume that we could leap magically into a beautiful socialist future without going through these tactical endeavors of a country like China or countries like Cuba, Nicaragua, and others working with countries intent on national development and pushing back the imperial world model in order to create space for alternative forms of modernization and development. And so in that regard, we should give tactical support to the multipolar world while never, ever losing sight of the strategy, and that is ultimately pushing in the direction of socialism.
Clear, absolutely clear. While you were talking, I was also thinking about that. In Europe, especially, we have this. We have the left parties and left thinkers mostly have a lot of problem with nationalism but also patriotism, and for good reasons. I mean, for historical reason. But because, as you were saying, also the socialist and the left movement started to exist in a period of inter-imperialist conflict, whereas the nationalism propaganda was used to how to say was used to cover the capitalistic interest of the different oligarchies of the different countries. That they were fighting each other, the capitalists of Italy against the capitalism in France, etc. But then we arrived, as Hudson says, in a super imperialism phase where there is only one center of capitalism, a super imperialism, we could say. And in that phase, we can see a fight between imperialism and patriotism and nationalism that are kind of fighting each other. So, for instance, here in Italy, we say in Ottolinatv that class struggle and national independence go together. Of course, was not the same in the 30s or in the 20s. So I don't know if I made myself clear, but it's a bit what we were saying, I think so.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it is important that national self-determination and the right to national development is not the same thing as bourgeois nationalism, which tends instead to traffic in the worst forms of social chauvinism, racism, misogyny, and a lot of other things, usually as well, depending on the particular form that it takes. And so I think it's very helpful to recognize that the form of nationalism that I take it that you're talking about more positively is one of national self-determination and national development, and the recognition that the way in which class struggle has played itself out within the imperial world is largely a struggle between nations. And that does take very different forms, right? Nations in the global south that have been subjected to centuries of colonialism, semi-colonialism, and contemporary imperialism, these are different struggles than, for instance, within European nations, in which many of the Western European nations are still junior partners in a broad imperialist project led by the United States to some extent, while many of them also have their own projects of national development in various ways. Those can be bourgeois forms of national development, capitalist forms of national development, including development that is dependent upon imperialism and colonialism. But they can also be projects of national sovereignty that are rooted in real substantive workers' democracy, which is very, very different than those forms of social chauvinistic nationalism. So the term nationalism is very tricky, right? It can be used as a pro-capitalist term or concept, but it can also be used as just a recognition of the democratic right of all peoples who share a nation to self-determination and to models of development that aren't subjected to imperialism.
Yes, absolutely. And I'll go to the second question, because I don't know if you agree, and we wanted to know your opinion on this. But in Western imperialist propaganda, we see that they always try to confuse the political culture and internal politics of the countries with their role at the international level. So, for instance, we often hear lefty people defend Israel in this case because it is supposedly more democratic than Arab states, or because there is a strong LGBTQ community, and so on, as if this justifies its colonial policies in Palestine and imperialism throughout all the Middle East region. And we actually hearing similar arguments regarding the US aggression toward China and so on. So what is your opinion on this?
Well, I think that bourgeois democracy in the imperialist world, and I would, of course, include Israel within that, is the best democracy that money can buy, which is a democracy purportedly that contributes to imperialism. So the idea that Israel is a democracy because it has bourgeois elections that are run very much like in the United States is an extremely hollowed out definition of democracy, particularly given the fact that it is a settler colony and an apartheid ethno-state that wages constant war on all of its neighbors and its internal population. In that regard, it's as democratic as one of the most kind of proudly self-declared democracies in the world, which is the United States. And it's interesting, of course, that the United States also is a settler colony, and it has a deep and ongoing history, just like Israel, of racial apartheid, functioning as an ethno-state, and endless imperial war. So in both of these cases, because in any case, contemporary Israel is in many ways an extension of the US empire and needs to be understood as such. There are mild differences and some rivalries, but in many ways, Israel is an imperialist wedge in West Asia that is fundamentally driven, supported by the United States. It's an imperial part of its overall project. In that regard, then, what we have in both cases is the term democracy is a propaganda term that is a fig leaf. It's trying to give the appearance of something that serves the interests of the people, when the reality is that we're dealing with plutocratic oligarchies that are engaged in settler colonial projects of racial apartheid and imperial wars. So it behooves us to see the reality behind the mask, if you will. And I'm glad that you connected to this kind of propagandistic use of the term and concept of democracy to that of identity politics more generally, because one of the fundamental functions of identity politics, as it arose within the US context during the neoliberal phase of capitalist accumulation, and has through cultural imperialism been spread around the world, one of its roles has been to provide cover for imperialism. What I mean by that is that identity politics cultivates representative and symbolic changes in order to maintain the fundamental substance of global class relations. One of the ways this has been done in the United States, but you see it in Israel as well, and many other imperial extensions or imperial partners of the United States, is that it's just like the comprador bourgeoisie has functioned historically, where imperial powers or colonial powers will prop up a local ruling elite that looks like, talks like, and shares the same general culture as the local population. That form of rule really obfuscates the set of relations because it makes it look like the imperial and colonial powers aren't controlling everything from behind the scenes. In the case of identity politics, what it does is it tends to lift up spokespeople, very select tokenized spokespeople, who superficially look like the historical victims of imperialism. So in the case of the United States, you used to have a white male ruling elite. Now you look at the elite and you have African Americans and you have Latinos and you have women and you have, so it's a much more diverse face to empire. Many people then are hoodwinked into believing that this is, if it's a more diverse looking empire, then somehow it must be softer on the global populations. Once again, this is a pure propaganda move, but it's a very, very good propaganda move because it's worked in many ways, shapes and forms, as the Obama presidency proved, for instance. And Kamala Harris, of course, is running on the same basic ticket, is diversity and more imperialism. In that regard, it also, though, behooves us to highlight the fact that the reason that the ruling class of imperial states has had to diversify is not due to its own choices. This is due to class struggle from below. It is the revolutionary anti-racist, pro-woman or pro-feminist, pro-queer, pro-trans uprisings from below that have forced the capitalist ruling class to change its face. They didn't want to do this, and it certainly would have been better for them just to continue business as usual. What they had to do, though, was to act as if they were integrating these class struggles, because racial struggles, gender struggles, struggles around sexuality are class struggles. They're struggling to change the social relations of production and reproduction. But what the capitalist ruling class has attempted to do is to recuperate domesticate those revolutionary elements of transformation in order to make them into basically window dressing for imperialism. And so the final thing that I'll say on that front, or actually there's two other elements that I just want to touch on quickly, is that it's very telling that the leading force in the world behind identity politics happens to be the leading imperialist power. We should all be aware of that and identify it for what it is. The US is also engaged in a teleological project. It's situating itself at the end of history, the cutting edge of political and symbolic developments, where they're much more diverse than even countries like the junior partners in Europe tend to be much less diverse in the imperial ruling class and their state managers than the United States, as well as the professional managerial class stratum. In that regard, there's an attempt to make these symbolic gestures into the real substance of politics and then posture or present the United States as the cutting edge of progressive political developments. But the last thing that I want to say is that it's very, very important in criticizing wokeness, identity politics, etc., to not lose sight of the deep history of class struggles from below that, as I mentioned a moment ago, the most quintessentially important elements have been economic struggles, but also struggles for the recognition of the full human dignity of all persons, regardless of race, gender, sexuality, etc. And so in criticizing identity politics, we should not pedal backward to forms of social chauvinism and that are very aggressive and very prominent, including within the left. Instead, we should I'll give a shout out to the great Domenico Losordo, because I know this show is broadcast in Italian as well. He claimed that what we need to do is universalize the false claims of liberal ideology. So liberal ideology says we're all free and equal. We need to actually universalize those claims. That is the agenda and the project of the left, not backpedaling to forms of social chauvinism that reject identity politics and then throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, by simply usually returning to what is ultimately a form of white male identity politics. No, we need a universalist project of lifting up the human dignity of all.
Clear. No, thank you. I think it's very, very interesting, very, very also important, because we are also seeing now in Italy some left movements that in some way are putting again the class struggle on the spotlight, but they tend to become always more and more polemical and critical, even against all the conquest that also the liberal and neoliberal thoughts and politics made in the last 30, 40 years. And in this conquest, of course, I put the feminism, I put the identity politics, the more awareness that there is about this. So, but it's very. I think it's very important, and it's a bit off topic, but I wanted to ask you. Your ideas, your thoughts a bit are in some way are spreading in the US. I mean, do you see more awareness more than before about these topics? And do you think also the pro-Palestine, pro-Pal movement in the US could be a good and strong tools to go back to talk again, also in the public opinion, about imperialism, about capitalism? Do you see this kind of good transformation?
Yes, absolutely. Of course, what's going on in West Asia is absolutely atrocious at the military level. The kind of genocidal rampage of a really unbridled sort is to be condemned in the strongest possible terms. And what we need is a ceasefire and peace and the reconstruction of a viable, real, Palestine with an ability for self-determination and development. But what you're alluding to is, given what's going on, it has really rocked the ideological framework of many people within the imperial core. In my own organizing and intellectual work, I'm mainly kind of in the United States and in France. And in both of those contexts, but I'll speak specifically about the United States, it's clear that the propaganda narrative and the cultural fascism that exists in this country has not been able to contain the story of what's going on in the ways that they would like. Hence the necessity of clamping down and using repressive mechanisms in order to try to shut down alternative voices. And what we have is an incredible moment of political education that is unbelievably important, particularly to young people in the country of the United States right now, because it's possible not only to see through the propaganda of the United States, supporting human rights and being progressive and being a force for democracy in the world, but, and this is the connection that we all have to make in our organizing and political education, what we have here is a clear case of imperialism. It is not just the Netanyahu and the Likud party that are rogue elements and that this can be chalked up to something that's exceptional. No, what's going on currently is part of a system of global governance, and young people and more generally those who have been radicalized by this moment should not stop at the level of, well, we need a ceasefire and then I can go back on autopilot and stop paying attention to what's going on. No, what's going on now should light people's fire in order to understand how the imperialist system works, as well as the necessity of combating it. And so in that regard, it's a great moment for political education and moving radicalization to a much higher level of political consciousness.
Clear. And last off-topic question. Next week, we are going to have the election in the US, and we can see that both Democratic and Republican parties, their conflict has very little to do with the structural part, capitalistic part of society, and with the imperialism. Why? Because it's what counts. It's what it's actually most important, and the cultural fight that they are in a way, they are in a way spreading. They can let. It's like we have the impression that they can let the people fight each other about identity politics and woke team, because they don't care a lot about them. So no problem if you fight about those topics. I don't know if you agree with this. You have this impression too, or?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, the culture wars have been used in the United States for a long time now in order to hide the class war. So if you can divide the population, get them to fight amongst themselves about cultural elements, then they don't fight their common enemy, which is the capitalist ruling class. Unfortunately, within US elections, the possibility of voting out imperialism or capitalism simply does not exist. It is never on the ballot. I do think, though, that in the current context, what is important is not simply, and here I'm speaking specifically to people who'd be voting within the US context, is to be oriented not to a kind of moral level of political assessment. In my entire lifetime, I've never had the opportunity of, voting imperialism out or voting capitalism out. It's always been about two different imperialist strategies. That's what's on the ballot. So let's just be clear about that. And that means operating at a higher level of political consciousness, not just moral consciousness. Political consciousness means that you have to ask very difficult tactical questions. Who is, given the extant play of forces, the candidate who would allow for the best or the most space for organizing and developing power to eventually, hopefully, overthrow imperialism, including within the imperial core? Given the position that Trump has taken on rolling back democracy, very clearly, he's on record stating repeatedly that there's not going to be another election. He's been crystal clear about that in his words and his actions. The absolute assault on the environment and the biosphere, where he is basically rejecting science and human knowledge across the board, combined with the fact that he is, unlike what some of the bourgeois media says, a very strong imperialist, very much in favor of war, on board with the Greater Israel Project and war with Iran. If someone like him comes into office, and I should add to that, the ongoing war on the migrant population, which is horrific to the extreme, but will be much, much worse under him. Kamala Harris has, she is not a candidate that one could or should morally support. That's clear. But if you're tactically thinking in political terms, I think there's a clear distinction between them at certain levels that makes it such that, particularly within US swing states, because that's where these elections are determined, it makes a lot of sense to vote for a candidate who is has a possibility of winning and who could make a tiny bit of difference insofar as there would be a greater margin of maneuver for progressive forces. And in that regard, this also has to be taken tactically. Our strategy is not going to be to vote the imperialists out of power. So this is a small tactical decision, but our main political energies should be focused really on developing progressive power across the board, which is the strategic orientation, I think, in this election season.
Clear. For the last two questions, I'd like to go to a more, we could say, theoretical level, because in your last article for the World Marxist Review, the title is "The Current State of the Social Sciences and How the World Marxist Review Might Be Able to Contribute to Making Scientific Advances." You here addressed the topic of the differences between the Marxian analysis of social sciences and the bourgeois one. So I'd like to ask you briefly, what are the fundamental differences?
Well, it's important to recognize that the bourgeois social sciences emerged and were consolidated institutionally as part of the capitalist world system as it was developing. And so the bourgeois social sciences go back to the 18th century, but were really consolidated in the latter third of the 19th century. And they're a response to a radically changing world because capitalism revolutionized social relations. And the bourgeois ruling class needed scientific tools for studying, analyzing, and trying as much as possible to control those. So we need to know the history of the bourgeois social sciences. And one element that is very, very important is that their very structure is a consequence of liberal ideology. So the bourgeois social sciences carve up the world. We have, for the analysis of civil society, we have a discipline called sociology. For the analysis of government, we have another discipline called, political science. For the analysis of economics, we have of the market, if you will, we have economics. So here we have, in a nutshell, already just with those three disciplines, one of the core elements of liberal ideology, that the market is separate from civil society, which is separate from the state. In addition to that, you have the discipline of history has developed really to focus on the history of the capitalist powers, and because of the assumption that they are the driving force behind history and the most important nations in the world. And disciplines like anthropology and what was called Orientalism, this term isn't used as much, but both of these disciplines emerged to study the underdeveloped, meaning underdeveloped by, as well, the history of capitalism, underdeveloped civilizations, so-called primitive civilizations in the case of anthropology, and nations that were developed but not according to the unilinear capitalist development that you see in the imperial core, which is what Orientalism focused on. So China, India, Persia, and places like this. And so you also have baked into the bourgeois social sciences the colonial regime, right? And anthropology, of course, has a deep and dark history of feeding into and playing the role of supporting colonial endeavors in various ways. All of this means then that what you have that's very different within, for instance, the dialectical and historical materialist tradition is that in this latter tradition, you have a holistic, systematic approach to the material world, in which it's recognized that civil society, economic, the market and government don't function as autonomous spheres, and that we need an account of the entire system of relations, not only within particular countries, but internationally, so that we can have an account of colonialism and neocolonialism for that matter. The other thing that I'd highlight, Lenin is very clear on this regard. He said that in one way or another, all official and liberal science defends wage slavery. What that means is all bourgeois science, ultimately, although it attempts to be and often qualifies itself as value neutral, is or has a normative orientation. It is ultimately dedicated at some level to shoring up and maintaining capitalism. In that regard, it's also important to recognize then that it's not only faulty at an epistemological level, what I mean is faulty at the level of its knowledge claims, but it's also faulty at the, sorry for the sophisticated vocabulary, but the axiological level, or regarding the system of values. And the very last thing that I'd say, and this is drawing on the great work of Walter Rodney, is that the social sciences, given that there are different ones, the bourgeois social sciences, and that if you study them, there are often competing paradigms within each of them, right? So I have degrees in sociology, and one of the touchstones in sociology is always saying that, well, there's an approach to sociology that draws on Weber, or there's another one that draws on Bourdieu, and you have different paradigms, or Comte, right? But the idea is that there are different interpretive paradigms, but there isn't a science of the social world. And the great Walter Rodney pointed out that it's very interesting that within the bourgeois world, you have science in the natural sciences. And this is important because the natural sciences are so essential to capitalist development and scientific progress, technological development, etc. But what the bourgeoisie doesn't want us to have is a science of the social, meaning a science by which we can analyze society as a social totality, including its relations internationally, understand its fundamental driving mechanisms, not in the sense that you would then be able to predict the future or reduce everything to simplistic mechanical laws, but you can have a sense of how class dynamics operate historically, and most importantly, gain insight into how you can change those class relations. That's what it ultimately means to have a science of the social. And so Walter Rodney points out that that's what's been excluded from the bourgeois social sciences. Opposed to that, dialectical and historical materialism provides us with all of the things that I've said that the bourgeois social sciences don't do. And so it's not surprising that the bourgeois sciences have also waged a kind of intellectual world war on dialectical and historical materialism to try to denigrate it, limit its reach, or claim that it's something that it's not, in order to downplay its real power, which has been proven through the successful elucidation of the world, as well as, most importantly, its ability to practically intervene and change class relations within the world. So in all of those ways, I think that, dialectical and historical materialism are a kind of force counterposed to the way in which bourgeois social sciences are ultimately contributing to shoring up an ideological worldview that serves the interests of the capitalist ruling class. And they're the ones who own and control the means of intellectual production. So it's not surprising that the production within the system that they own and control would serve their interests.
Yes. Unfortunately, I know very well how Department of Humanities and Philosophy works. No, so it's I think it's absolutely as you described. I had just last one question that is linked to this one, actually, because in 2017 you wrote an article titled "The CIA Reads the French Theory" on the intellectual labor of dismantling the cultural left. The question, of course, it's big and very important, but do you believe that today there are the structural conditions to overcome that phase of European philosophy that is actually very linked to what you were saying before, and for a rebirth of Marxist studies and philosophy in the sense of the materialism and dialectic?
Well, I think it's important that from a dialectical and historical materialist vantage point, it's not ideas that lead the world, or consciousness that drives existence. As Marx and Engels said, it's existence that drives consciousness. And so a first element of response to your question is that we are living through a sharpening of global contradictions, in particular, the contradiction between the imperialist world system on the one hand and the emergent multipolar world on the other, with the socialist powers, and in particular China, playing very much a leading role in that regard. And there are many, many signs of imperial decline. In that regard, there is a way in which the intellectual realm mirrors, in a very mediated and semi-autonomous fashion, these sharpening contradictions. And so on the one hand, you do see a very strong and powerful emergence of an anti-imperialist intellectual community, if you will, that has, of course, been there before, but this has come in ebbs and flows, and we are certainly not at the high level that we saw in the 60s and 70s, and certainly not at the high level, the even higher level that we saw in the 1930s. But there are a lot of intellectuals, cultural producers, organizers, young people, etc., who are increasingly interested in socialist politics and interested in struggling and combating imperialism, which is great for the direction that the world needs to go in if we want to avoid nuclear apocalypse, the complete and utter collapse of the biosphere, or other Armageddon-like ends to humanity and maybe life in general on planet Earth. But, and this is the flip side of that, given the sharpening of global contradictions and global class struggle, you also have an increasing circling of the wagons on the part of what we can refer to as the anti-imperialist Western left. The anti-imperialists, I'm borrowing this term from someone like William I. Robinson, but there are many other people who use it, are those who often are self-declared Marxists or socialists, definitely situate themselves on the left, but they very explicitly reject anti-imperialists, often pointing to them by name and saying, we disagree with these people for many different reasons that I don't need to go into. But what's most important for us to understand is, and here we don't need a deep and sophisticated philosophic lesson in Hegel to understand what a negation of the negation means. The anti-imperialist leftists are imperialists, and they're telling us it themselves because they are not against the struggle against imperialism. In that regard, I think that what I already see in the current moment is an intensification of the class struggle, theoretically and ideologically, between the anti-imperialists on the one hand and these anti-imperialists on the other. But I do think, or at least this is my current conviction, because of the extant play of forces, these anti-imperialists are playing a losing game, because what they're trying to do is continue the tradition of intellectuals, cultural leaders, and pundits playing to empire because it serves their interests, because they get advancement through empire by doing so. And so there's an opportunism that's really baked into their project at a profound level. And given that imperialism there are many signs of its decay in various ways, while it still remains very strong, so we should not have any illusions about it, I think that they're playing in many ways a losing opportunist game, and that the odds, if we had to bet, are on our side, and they should be on our side if we're interested in building a world in which the humanity, in general, and the biosphere more specifically, has any future to speak of.
Thank you, Professor. I think it was a very, very interesting conversation. I'm sure that it's going to be our Italian audience is going to love it. So thank you very much, and I hope we are going to have other opportunity to talk and to host you in our channel. So thank you very much again, and I thank everybody for listening to us, and see you in the next episode.
And thank you so much. I'd come back on with great pleasure. Keep up the great work. It's very important. It's part of the broader cultural class struggle. We need all hands on board, and we need to do it collectively. So thank you for everything that you do.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.